Okay, I would like now to turn the floor to my colleague, Timothy Papadopoulos, who is going to introduce our next speaker and moderate the next session. Timos?
Hi to everyone. Daryl, first of all, thanks for an excellent talk. We have learned a lot, and at the same time, we have started thinking whether there are chances like for us to overcome the challenges that come with a pandemic for research. So there's a long way to go, and particularly when we consider that there are several projects that they were just halfway through, perhaps, when the pandemic showed up. So it is rather challenging for us to be able to tackle any issues. So let me now introduce Dr. Adam Hampshire, our next speaker. A few words about Adam, who has undertaken his degree and PhD at King's College, Cambridge. He is now a principal investigator at the Computational, Cognitive and Clinical Neuroimaging Laboratory at Imperial College London, and is a Dementia Research and Institute investigator. His lab conducts research at the interface between medicine, psychology, neuroscience, engineering, and artificial intelligence. With a strong interest in understanding the nature and brain basis of human intelligence, Dr. Hampshire is author of over 80 research articles, including in top-tier journals, Nature, Science, Neuron, and Nature Communications. The intelligence testing games that he developed have been used to assess hundreds of thousands of people and are used in research around the globe. So it is great to have Dr. Hampshire today with us. Dr. Hampshire's talk today focuses on internet-based cognitive assessments, aiming to provide some insights from focused clinical studies and the Great British Intelligence Test. So, Dr. Hampshire, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to present today. And I just want to say how, echoing what Daryl was saying earlier, it's so critical that we still manage to run events such as these to discuss critical current issues. Now, actually somewhat motivated by Daryl's presentation, I've switched some of my slides around, I have to confess, because I've got some really interesting new data that's being collected online that pertains to the impact of the COVID-19 on cognition and also the impact of the pandemic on mental health. So if I share screen, if I can just work out how to do that. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. So the data I'm going to talk about today has been captured in the context of a large-scale population study that I've run primarily in the UK called the Great British Intelligence Test. And this was a collaborative project with BBC Horizon, BBC Two Horizon, in fact, to be specific. And it's interesting because that collaboration allowed us to have great reach in terms of the diversity of people that we tested in the UK population and also the number. So just to give a little bit of background on the structure of the study, essentially we put together a set of my cognitive tests that can be run via the web browser online. So here you can see we're looking at things like spatial reasoning and planning, spatial memory, phonological memory, verbal reasoning, selective attention, mental manipulation, word knowledge, and emotion processing discriminations. And those tests are then followed by quite an extensive questionnaire looking at aspects of social demographics, but also the sort of context people find themselves in and their personalities and their mental health. Now, this battery of tests was put onto my website, the Cognitron website, which is able to handle very large numbers of people all in parallel. And the BBC Two Horizon, alongside BBC News, made this very visible at the beginning of January. And so here you can see a sort of timeline of the numbers of people who came and completed all of the tests and the questionnaire. So in January, we had a couple of 100,000 members of mostly the UK public complete the study. And you can see towards the left, this is a log scale. So we had this kind of big spike towards the beginning of the month. And then as we were no longer sort of foveated in the public eye, that sort of dropped off. We're still collecting thousands of data sets per week through February, March and April. But then in May, when a documentary came out that was reporting some of our preliminary findings, that came out BBC Two, BBC pushed people back onto the website again. So we have this second big spike in participants. So we have about 120,000 people took part in the study during May. And you can see we then have this sort of decline again in terms of the number of people hitting the site per day. Now, in May, because I knew this was going to happen, and in response to the pandemic, I extended the questionnaire that we had to capture information about whether people had pre-existing clinical conditions that were relevant to susceptibility to the coronavirus, but also whether they'd actually been ill and suspected it was coronavirus, what their symptoms were, and whether they'd had a positive biological test. We also captured information pertaining to the mental health impact of the pandemic, and so how people felt they'd been affected, how their behaviour had been affected, and also free text in their own words regarding what they felt the main positive and negative impact was on them, and what it is that they were personally finding helped and that they would recommend for other people. And so hopefully today I'll get through talking at a very high level about some of these results. I'm not sure if I'll cover everything we've got so far, but I'll see where I get to in half an hour. So first of all, in terms of the nature of the cohort, I should say this is a particularly, I think there's a lot of lessons to learn here actually regarding how engaging mainstream media can give you an unusual reach, because we had high inclusivity. So about 14% of participants in the study are ethnic minority, pretty much a one-to-one male to female split. We've got thousands of people who identify as non-binary. We've got per age more than 100 people, all the way up into the late 80s. Wide range of education, and tens of thousands of people actually who have pre-existing neurologic psychiatric conditions took part in the study in May alone. Now, we also record things like device. So given all of this, we were able to sort of characterize cognitive performance and aspects of mental health, whilst factoring out a wide range of socio-demographic and device variables with a high certainty. On the right-hand side here, you can see the plots of the cognitive task summary scores in standard deviation units as a function of age. And what you can see is that the tasks tend to show some age-related decline. That decline varies, but actually you'll see one line here that's going up and up. That's looking at people's knowledge of words. And this is an aspect of crystallized intelligence. It's something that we improve at essentially through the lifespan, which I think is quite nice because there's often too much of a focus just on the decline in age. In terms of neurological populations, you can see here we had ranging in the hundreds people with Parkinson's, stroke, traumatic brain injury, and multiple sclerosis. And on the graph, you can see a breakdown of task performance costs of being in one of those categories relative to people who don't have neurological pre-existing conditions. We're in standard deviation units. And the reason I've included this is I think it gives a nice sort of benchmark for some of the subsequent results I'll show in terms of the sorts of effect size we would expect to see for cognitive deficits on these tests. So if you note, we're in the sort of 0.25 to 0.35 standard deviation range. So moving on, in terms of the numbers of people who said that they suspected that they had had the coronavirus, you can see on the top left that we've got, so this is all data just from May, okay? So amongst approximately 80,000 people, we have many thousands who said they were ill, had no respiratory symptoms. We have about 1,500 who had respiratory symptoms and received no medical assistance. Somewhere just over 100 had assistance at home for respiratory symptoms. Somewhere just over 100 were taken to hospital, not put on a ventilator. And then we've got around about 80 people who were put on a ventilator in the hospital. And they've subsequently gone online and done this set of tests. Now, in terms of biological tests, then the proportions of these different groups who've had a positive biological test is obviously quite skewed. So pretty much everyone who was on a ventilator in the hospital had a positive biological test, whereas those who received no medical assistance at home, well, the percentage is lower. So moving on, in terms of task performance, using this sort of respiratory symptom severity as a kind of proxy for the severity of the illness, you can see that the degree of cognitive performance deficit scales with those symptoms, essentially. And actually we're getting up to, by the time we get to people who've been put on ventilators in hospital, we're up in the sort of 0.6 standard deviation range in terms of cognitive deficits. It's pretty substantial. I mean, that's more than we saw for any of those neurologic conditions that I pointed out a minute ago. But this is perhaps unsurprising. I mean, we know that being put on a ventilator is pretty bad for you. Now, compared to that, though, if you look at the subgroup who were not put on a ventilator but were taken to hospital, we've still got quite substantial cognitive deficit compared to controls. I should say this is after factoring out a wide range of socio-demographic variables, age, and pre-existing conditions, neurologic, psychiatric, but also conditions that you can see listed down on the bottom here, such as diabetes and liver disease. So this paints perhaps a little bit of a worrying picture. And I think looking forwards, based on this, we really need to know, do these sorts of deficits, are they sustained long term? What's the trajectory? And do they have any sort of relationship to markers in the brain? And there's now a couple of quite large scale studies in the UK where they're doing brain imaging and looking at imaging markers of pathology in the brain in people who've recovered after being very ill with coronavirus. And they're adopting some of these tests behaviourally so we can cross-compare and try and understand sort of neurobiological base a bit better. On a finer grain, cognitively, there's a question of whether particular domains might have been affected. And what you can see here is where I've factor analysed across the tasks that people did, and using essentially a principal component analysis with a vary-max rotation and taking the Kaiser convention, it appears that we have three factors that underlie, or three abilities that underlie people's performances across the tasks at large. And these include things like semantic problem solving, which captures, for example, verbal analogies, attention, and spatial working memory. And what you can see is it looks like the thing that had the highest sensitivity is semantic problem solving, followed by attention. But the effects we see for spatial working memory are somewhat less. Now, down at the bottom here, you can see this broken down by individual task. And so essentially the numbers on the far right are for people who had the worst respiratory symptoms and ended up on ventilators. And again, you can see things like word definitions and verbal analogies. Those types of semantic problem-solving tasks are the ones that show the greatest deficit. We also have, though, target detection, for example, and 2D manipulations. But some aspects, actually, some of the tasks we ran showed very little difference at all, and digit span is a good example of that. The span tasks seem to be not particularly sensitive. So moving forwards, in terms of the interim summary, this sort of online cognitive assessment approach, it can be delivered at scale and actually for little cost. So I would estimate my research costs for this study, which overall I think we've collected somewhere in the order of we're nearly 400,000 people actually this year now. It's probably in the low tens of thousands. But you know, the thing that really makes this powerful is sort of building those links into people in mainstream media who can make the studies attractive and visible to the general public, so attractive to take part in. And I think there's quite a lot that can be learned from that. What I'm going to do actually is that, because I'm aware of the limitations of time, I'm going to move forwards onto the more mental health focused component of this. And so here, I've got essentially 3 components of the questionnaire that pertain to mental health. One is the NHS mood self-assessment, and that's data that we've collected right from the beginning of the year, and we're still collecting now, so all the way through from just before the pandemic hitting the UK. Another is self-perceived impact scale, and that's something myself and a group of collaborators across different universities in the UK put together to try and understand how the pandemic was actually affecting people's behaviour and their daily lives. So we'll come back to a little bit more information on that later. And this we introduced during May. And finally, there's free text mining. And that's where I've asked people to just write in their own words how they've been affected. Now, I'm going to try and get through some initial analyses of each of these 3 things in the time we've got, but I might not get through the free text mining. So first of all, there's a question of whether the mean mood assessment measures differ pre to mid pandemic lockdown. Now, I've got 6 of the individual item questions that we looked at here up on screen. And these are couched in the sort of form, how often in the past 2 weeks have you felt down or depressed? How often in the past 2 weeks have you felt nervous, anxious, or on edge? So it's very much a sort of what I would think of as a reporting of the symptoms of depression and anxiety and such like. And what you can see on the top left is that in terms of our measure of insomnia, that hadn't really changed in the period of time just before the pandemic to in the middle of the lockdown. Next down, you can see sleep, though. People were, if anything, sleeping a bit longer. And that kind of makes perhaps a certain amount of sense because they're commuting into work less, for example. This is something I'll return to in more detail later. Tiredness, we see very little change actually in tiredness. But the big change, relatively speaking, was anxiety. And you can see that anxiety levels, which, sorry, I should qualify, that's in the beige line at the top here. The blue line is pre-pandemic here in the UK. This orange line is mid-lockdown. And so you can see where we've analysed every single day for 31 days following our 2 launches, we see the same consistent difference between these periods of time. So essentially anxiety levels had gone up a fair bit. We didn't see an overall average increase in depression rates, and we didn't see much change in concentration. So at least if we just treat everyone homogeneously and say, what's the overall mean difference, then the main difference that we were seeing pertained to anxiety. But I think, as Darryl alluded to earlier, this probably isn't the best way of treating the data, because people are likely to have been affected in really quite different idiosyncratic ways, depending on their personalities and their contexts. And so I tried looking at how these sorts of changes varied as a function of first language, ethnicity, education level, income, sex, and country people were living in. And here you can see that we do see some quite substantial changes. So just to try and explain what this scale is, essentially the bigger the circle is, the bigger the change or difference rather that we see pre to mid pandemic. And that's in standard deviation units. If it's in green, it's a decrease. And if it's in pink, it's an increase. And so, for example, with sleep, it's the case that students are sleeping a lot more. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised by that. In terms of anxiety levels, the change or difference in anxiety levels is greater, for example, for females and males, and actually slightly greater again for those people who are non-binary. And you can also see here sort of differences in terms of anxiety as a function of socioeconomic status. Now, I don't want to go into this in too much detail. There's actually a real wealth of data here, and this is a data resource that I'm making available for other groups than mine as well. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting is that retired people and homemakers, they also appear to be showing a greater increase in anxiety. And actually that really brings me nicely to the age effects that we see here. So there's a question of which age group shows the greatest change, or the greatest difference rather, between pre and mid-pandemic in these measures. And it looks to me like overwhelmingly it's older adults who are showing the larger negative changes. For example, if we look here, we have anxiety as a function of age. And this is essentially giving us the delta, the difference between January and May. And we've got a 0.43 standard deviation increase in anxiety for the older adults, whereas teenagers in the 20s, that difference is much smaller. You can see depression is a bit higher as well for older adults. In terms of hours slept, it's teenagers and younger adults are reporting that they're sleeping longer. And so I think perhaps this could motivate that we need a bit more of a focus on the impact on these aspects of mental health in older adults. Okay, so moving on to self-perceptions of pandemic impact. And this is where people are essentially answering questions about how they personally have been affected in their daily lives and behaviour, as opposed to symptoms of depression and anxiety. Now, so what we put together essentially was a 47 item scale to probe this, and the sort of form of that was please indicate how well the following statement describes the impact of the lockdown on you. What I'm not going to do today is go through all 47 items because it would take too long, but essentially each of those items is answered on a 5-point strongly agree, agree a bit, neither agree nor disagree, disagree a bit, strongly disagree scale. Okay. Now, just looking again at the overall mean, what you can see is some of the strongest agreement, interesting, was with positive items on our pandemic impact scale. And over on the right-hand side here, you can see more people would tend to agree with the statement that they're spending less and saving more. But we've also got negative items that people in general are more likely to agree with, such as that they've had lots of leisure activities and health-related activities. An interesting thing is, in terms of actual concern for health, you can see that people are generally not so concerned about their own health. They're more concerned about the health of their loved ones, those who are close to them. And in terms of positives, actually, one of the things that really came out of this, which resonated for me, was a lot of people agreeing with that they're appreciating the simpler things in life more. There's more wildlife, and there's a more pleasant external environment. And that's, I think that's quite interesting. You wonder sometimes whether there are things we can't learn from the current situation, things that are positive that we could perhaps try and take forwards. For example, quite a few people agree that they're commuting less and sleeping more. Another thing is there are quite a lot of people, actually one of the things people most overwhelmingly agree with is that they are more able to stay in touch with loved ones who they previously didn't have the time for, but now they're doing that using apps and online technologies. Now, there's a lot to digest in terms of this set of items. So what we did is we applied a principal component analysis to it in order to reduce it down into a set of underlying components. And really the hypothesis here was that all of these items wouldn't just squash onto one positive linear axis. Instead, there'd be multiple dimensions to the ways in which people have been affected. And so here you can see when we do that, we arrive at somewhere in the order of 12 different components that underlie self-perceived impact of the pandemic. Using more stringent permutation analysis, it would perhaps be about 7 components. And so we can take those component scores and we can look at how they vary as a function of population variables to see who is it who's being affected in what type of a way. Now, these 11 components that have been estimated in this version of the model, they include more free time, less stressed, and reduced tiredness. So that's one of the things that vary. That's the first component. It's the thing that varies the most in the population. Then you can see loneliness and disruption of normal life, positive outlook, increased conflict at home, increased health obsession, increased work engagement and efficiency, improved environment, concern about unhealthier lifestyle, time for people, connectedness, and better sleep. And so essentially, these are different dimensions that describe the idiosyncratic ways that people consider that they've been affected. Now, linking back to the earlier analysis, I've run two forms of correlation between the mood self-assessment, looking at symptoms of depression, anxiety, etc., and the pandemic impact scale, looking at how people consider themselves to have been affected. And there's a strong shared covariance between these, and that's the case in terms of bivariate correlation, but also multivariate correlation. I'm not going to go into detail about this analysis, but I think it's important because I think it gives a validity to the self-perceived impact scale. People think they're being affected, they consider themselves to be affected in this way, and that in turn is predictive of symptoms of depression, anxiety, insomnia, and attention problems. Now, as I was saying, we can look at these dimensions of self-perceived impact as they relate to population variables. And there's a myriad of interesting statistically significant relationships, as you can imagine, in a data set this size. But one of the biggest ones is for age, again. And here you can see a graph on the right. This is looking at the mean score on the health concerns component for people calculated at each age. And then I've cross-correlated that just for display purposes on the plot. And you can see essentially that people who are older are much more likely to be worried about health for themselves and their loved ones. And that's not a small difference. We're talking a 1 standard deviation unit difference pretty much between people who are in their 20s and people who are in their 80s. And of course, this is in turn predictive of depression, anxiety, etc. Moving on, one of the other biggest predictors that we see here is, I should say these age effects, that this sort of age relationship is also evident for other components, but I don't have time to report all of them here. One of the other biggest predictors is occupational status, so what sort of job someone's doing. And so to give an example, with more time, less stressed and less tired, well, funnily enough, frontline health workers are much less likely to agree with that sentiment. They're not less tired at all. Conversely, those who've been furloughed, well, actually, yeah, they've got a bit more time, and they are less tired. They're at the opposite end of the scale. You can look at here at more health concerns. Those who are shielded or disabled, they score highest in terms of increased health concerns. More engagement at work is interesting. So this is a positive aspect to pandemic impact. And these healthcare workers who perhaps they're not less stressed, they don't have more time, but actually they feel more engaged by their work, which is an interesting sort of counterbalance. You can see in terms of worried about unhealthy lifestyle, disabled and shielded again, more affected. So there's this really interesting set of relationships there. Moving on, one of the points Darryl raised earlier was to do with minority groups. And here you can see on the graph on the right, when it comes to increased health concerns, there are some groups who have significantly higher health concerns. And this will no doubt be then in turn impacting on anxiety levels. And on the left, you can see for conflict at home, this is actually very much related to who it is you live at home with. And funnily enough, if you're at home with small, if you're in the lockdown and you have small children, this is the type of thing that's predictive of having problems in terms of increased conflict at home. I also looked at the relationship to pre-existing psychiatric conditions, and there's some very interesting relationships here too. So on the top right, you can see that those people who report pre-existing anxiety and relatedly obsessive compulsive disorder, they are more likely to be concerned about their health and the health of those close to them. Whereas if we look at people who have attentional deficit hyperactivity disorder, they're more likely to report increased conflict at home. And so again, at things that pertain to essentially someone's traits, that these in turn are likely to have a sort of a mediating relationship on how the pandemic is affecting them. Now, of course, this analysis here is cross-sectional. We really need the longitudinal grain to confirm modulation and mediation. Right, so I'm going to jump over the personality traits because I'm running out of time, and move on to the free text analysis as the last part that I'm going to discuss. So here, I asked people 3 questions to answer in free text. And those are, what were the main negatives? What were the main positives? And what is it that you found has helped you that you would recommend for others? Now, I've used one of the simplest forms of topic modelling to analyse the free text responses from about 50,000 people for those questions. And it's very interesting because when we try and estimate how many topics are there in that large corpus of free text, when it comes to the negatives, it's a relatively small number of topics. So we found just 5. There's not being able to see relatives, and actually particularly older relatives, disruption of social and recreational activities, problem working and schooling from home, physical and mental health concerns, frustration with politics, government and media. And so those are the most prevalent, the most common topics in what people just express when given complete free range, say how have they been negatively affected. In terms of positives, it's slightly higher dimensional. So we have more free time, including for recreation, enjoying the outdoors and wildlife, more time with family, slower pace of life, more time to focus on other important things, better natural environment, more regular digital contact, time for new skills and exercise, positive longer-term global change and community spirit. But the really interesting thing, I think, is when we get to the advice topics. And there, which I'll skip forwards to, there's actually about 50 topics. So the things that people find help, they're very broad. I've got the list on the right here, but I just wanted to make this final point, which is the prevalence of these topics, whether someone's like to report with these themselves, is very much defined by their context and the other population variables. And one of the strongest of those variables is age. So what it is that people find say has helped them. For example, if you're an older adult, it's really quite different to if you're a younger adult. And I do think that there might be potential for building interventions based around people's self-reported expert lived experiences in this way. I think that's a very promising future direction. So on that note, I think I'll wrap up because I believe I'm running out of time. But thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Adam. Okay, too loud here. So it was just impressive, like so many data all collected within a semester, if I understood well, like 6 months.
It's been, all of the data has been collected so far this year. So there's around about 200,000 people in January and about 120,000 people in May. And the total amount so far through the year is about 400,000. I'm hoping that we'll hit 500,000 by the end of the year.
Okay. I have a question, but I'll take first those that have been asked by other colleagues. And I'll just start with one here that I just see from Fofi. First of all, she thanks you for this important work and asks about your experience. What are the barriers in conducting online assessment with individuals who have acquired neurological deficits beyond access to technology?
Okay, so you have to be very careful in your design of the interface, particularly when it comes to populations who may have some tremor and motor deficits. Additional to that, you've got to consider in the cognitive task design in particular, making sure a person is able to understand what the requirements of the task are. But that has to be done in a way that's brief and succinct, because otherwise you'll put participants off. And additionally, you have to make sure that your tasks scale difficulty from a range that practically anybody can do, and then calibrates up such that you can measure people at the top end of performance. Because otherwise, what will happen is if you have someone who has moderate cognitive problems, they may not be able to engage in the task. But at the same time, if you try and calibrate things to be too inclusive in that respect, without considering the upper band, you get ceiling effects. So actually, I spent more than a decade developing these particular cognitive tests so they give that sort of range. It's tricky.
Yeah,
Okay.
most likely. Veronica also asks whether this study looked at any cognitive effects of the different medication that has been used until now to treat COVID-19 symptoms? And if no, is this something that we should be looked at a later stage, even in your study?
I think that's a fantastic idea. We've not done it, but we are due to recontact the cohort. We're just getting set up to do that now. We're hoping to retest people in the coming month and probably 6 months from now as well. And part of that will be reshaping the questionnaire instrument that we're using. So that's exactly the type of thing that could potentially be worked into the recontact aspect of the study. And actually, we're on that with the recontact. It's really critical because it's going to give us a deeper granularity on the different populations that have pre-existing conditions, and we get the longitudinal grain. So everything I've presented today is, to be clear, it's very large scale, but it's cross-sectional. And I'd really like to see within subject change and analyse that as well going forward.
Okay. I have also two questions, if I may. First of all, I believe, where's my questions here? Yeah, sorry, I have missed this. Give me a minute, yeah. I believe that what you presented is impressive regarding the scope, magnitudes, and importance of research and practice findings. And I have two questions. How national bioethics committees you believe would welcome such projects to be carried out remotely when children are involved? This is number one. And the second is, what infrastructure is required in terms of computational tools for such a project, and what would be a reasonable timeline for groundwork?
Okay. We've got several questions there. So first of all, conducting this type of research with children, I think it can be done. The ethics application process and making sure things are sound is obviously more complex. With this study, there are children. We have no limits on the age, but what we do is anyone who's under the age of 16, we have a reduced questionnaire. And it doesn't include any of the questions that pertain to mental health impact. And the reason for that is because of the nature of how things transpired, we simply didn't have time to sort everything out in terms of an ethics process that would involve mental health questionnaires in children. It can be done. In terms of the run-in time to get something up and get it ready to go, that really depends on your starting point. So let's say, for example, the technology already exists and you know, and just made quick, you know, with the software package that we have, this is a thing that is being made available for many studies, and we can handle a lot of data, and actually all the tests can be flipped between different languages very easily. So in a context where the technology pre-exists, you can get it up and running very fast. It's the main limitation is going to be the ethics. If you're trying to develop the technology from the ground up, then it would depend on how well you're funded. I should think you could probably do it in maybe 6 months to a year if you went to a software engineering company, but it would be very expensive. The requirements are somewhat unique in terms of the technology. So if you run a study in this way, where the way in which you get lots of people engaged is through mainstream media, the data comes in spikes. And so you can literally go from 1 minute where you've got 20 people on your site to another minute where 1,000 people are logging in to do your study every minute. And so that requires a very flexible cloud-based computing system. We run everything on the Amazon Elastic Cloud. And it's been quite a journey actually getting things calibrated to do all that type of spiky recruitment.
Good. Well, rather challenging altogether.
Yeah.
Fofi also asked whether you would be interested in validating your protocols in Greek.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I said, all of the tasks that we have, you can essentially switch them to any language. I think anything that's Unicode 8, so which I'm pretty sure means different character sets as well. For each task, you essentially just put in a translations file, it's like a text file, and then we can switch between the languages.
Okay. So I don't see that there is any other questions. So yeah, our time also is running, and therefore, yes, I would like to thank you. It was an excellent talk indeed. So many things to digest for us, I mean, and think not only creatively, but trying just to tackle the challenges that we have now. You know, there are several projects, as I mentioned earlier, which are already midway, and we think about how the testing could take place. So you have just delivered some excellent ideas, and well, it takes time, of course, to put them in practice, but it is important to consider. So thank you very much, Adam. I hope you have the time to stay with us a little bit longer today, and certainly we look forward to meet you in person when we have the time. So I'll just pass now to Fofi, the microphone and the camera. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you everyone. Thank you, Daryl. Thank you, Adam. We're going to move on to the e-poster presentations. And those of you who have registered, you have your Zoom link. The rest of us will come back in 30 minutes for our next invited presentation by Georgios Nikolopoulos. Thank you.